What's up, YouTube? This is Knowledge of Self-Determination with the second installment in this three-part series of a brief history of the police and their relationship with black people. So I'm going to just jump right into it. This first scene here, just take some time to soak this information in and always remember this. The criminalization of African people and the over-policing of African communities was by design. In order to discredit and ultimately destroy the civil rights and the Black Power movements, America would enlist the help of the intelligence community. FBI would spawn COINTELPRO, CIA, DEA, and of course, local law enforcement would be used to completely dismantle the African communities and their movements for equality. President Richard Nixon thought that it would be a good idea to make African people and their communities the face of the war on drugs. In 1968, he decided to associate hippies with marijuana and Africans with heroin in order to criminalize these two groups. The first was opposed to the Vietnam War, and the latter fighting for their freedom and civil liberties, obviously. Here is some food for thought. Richard Nixon declared the war on drugs in 1968, a time when the mandatory minimum sentencing for marijuana was 2 to 10 years, with fines up to $20,000. In 1970, Congress repealed the mandatory sentencing. Coincidentally, in that very same year, Richard Nixon says that the war on Africans, or drugs, as I like to call it, was quote-unquote public enemy number one, and that hippies were the face of marijuana and blacks were the new faces of heroin. Just take some time to think about what is being implicated here. Jagga Hoover, in 1968, makes a statement that has been linked to him for decades now. In a memo that was released in March 1968, Hoover is quoted as stating COINTELPRO's goal, one of them, was to, quote, prevent the rise of a messiah figure who could unify the militant black nationalist movement, end quote. To also, quote, pinpoint potential troublemakers and neutralize them, end quote. So fighting for your freedom in the quote-unquote land of the free is seen as a revolutionary act and an attack on American sovereignty that must be met with military-style force. Life, liberty, freedom, happiness, and equality for the most part are things that Africans were trying to gain in America. However, for some reason, the American government and a large portion of the white population found those notions offensive, while simultaneously believing that America stands for those very ideals. John Ehrlichman, Nixon's former domestic policy chief, had some very interesting things to say to a reporter named Dan Bayham. Apologize for mispronouncing his name. Ehrlichman admitted to the reporter that by, quote, criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities, end quote. He also went on to say, quote, we could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them, end quote. This is, I think, one of the most famous statements by John Ehrlichman, which pretty much sums up how Richard Nixon and his cabinet felt about black people and the war on drugs. Quote, did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did, end quote. Former domestic policy chief for Richard Nixon. Now take some time to read this statement here because this is another profound admission by this man. Public enemy number one is a quote from a press conference given by the then President Richard Nixon on June 18, 1971, in reference to the war on drugs. As we have seen moments ago, the American government had associated certain individuals with particular drugs. So in essence, by criminalizing those drugs, they actually criminalized the individuals who they considered undesirable. Drugs have been a part of America since the 1800s. The Black Power and Civil Rights movements operated largely under the banner of the Constitution and what it was supposed to stand for. Operating under and within the law made it hard for the government to keep these groups quiet. However, with COINTELPRO being joined by the now war on drugs, all you need is for people to be suspected of drug use. With that in play, you can now discredit, disorganize, eliminate, and neutralize these organizations while criminalizing Africans and their supporters. Here's another graphic. I just want you guys to just soak this information in. In 1973, we see the creation of the Drug Enforcement Agency, DEA. This was just 3 years after Ehrlichman exposed the truth about who would be the likely targets of the government's war on drugs. Before the war on drugs was declared and immediately after, there was no drug epidemic in the black community. Repeat, there was no drug epidemic in the black community. There were some Vietnam vets who came home addicted to heroin, a drug they used during the war to mostly self-medicate, and there was also marijuana usage. Black people did not have the funds or the means in which to support heavy drug usage. This was something you found more in white communities, but white people were not the ones targeted by the government. Another graphic. When I get to these, just pause them and read the information there, because this racial disparity percentage is all thanks to the war on drugs. With Richard Nixon's war on drugs well underway, it is only a matter of time before black communities all across the country would face as dark as ours. With government agencies like the CIA, DEA, and FBI, COINTELPRO, working around the clock, it was soon to come. 1975 would start to see the rapid decline of what the civil rights and black power movements used to mean. What would emerge would be more militant groups who tried as hard as they could to fight back. However, without the direction and leadership they once had, that sort of militancy would cause more problems than it solved. The American government was not ignorant to the effects of cocaine and what it could do to poverty-stricken environments. They had plenty of data from places such as Peru and Bolivia, where upper and middle class people were abandoning normal human life because of addiction. Bazuco, a sticky paste that is the first stage in the process of refining coca leaves into powder. In this form, cocaine could be smoked, and it was overwhelmingly addictive. In fact, the pharmacological effects were the same as smoking crack. In the early to mid-1970s, Peruvian psychiatrist Raul Jerry and Bolivian psychiatrist Dr. Niles Noya both reported on the dangers of cocaine usage and also cocaine psychosis. Dr. Robert Bick, a professor of psychiatry and pharmacology, admitted that in the early 1970s, quote-unquote, we gave a great deal of cocaine to many individuals. Dr. Bick and a medical student of his at the time had a conversation in 1978 about cocaine use. In one portion of the conversation, it was stated that, quote, if this ever hits the U.S., we're in deep trouble, end quote. Dr. Bick and his colleagues studied the findings of Dr. Jerry and Dr. Noya. So America not only knew where the cocaine was coming from, they knew who supplied it, what the effect would be on people, and who the people were that they were going to administer it to. So really, how much longer can the American government deny that this was the plan all along? To police, or rather over-police, black communities. According to Dr. Bick, the Food and Drug Administration would not allow, quote-unquote, any serious research to be done on the effects of drug addiction. In 1974, freebasing had emerged. Freebasing was basically smoking cocaine in powdered form, which quickly became a problem. And while this was taking place, the CIA was collecting data on the destructive nature of this drug. In 1980, there was a virtual explosion of crack cocaine in the black community. A 19-year-old Ricky Ross somehow grew into Southern California's largest drug dealer, with connections to the CIA via Nicaraguan Contras. Where would a 19-year-old high school dropout get those kinds of connections? Now read this. This is from Boys in the Hood. Read this and soak this in. And who the people who are potentially profiting from the war on drugs are. Just soak this information in. It is very important to keep certain things in mind when addressing this issue of drugs in America. Black people have not ever controlled any distribution in this country. Even as we speak, with all of the accumulated wealth that Africans and Americans have, we do not control the importing or exporting of any goods, legal or otherwise. There are no black people in America that own, control, or have a majority share of any weapons manufacturing in America either. But for some reason, our communities seem to be overrun with these products that only serve to feed the prison industrial complex. With all of the information available, could this really be just coincidence? In 1977, President Jimmy Carter wanted to focus attention on the supply side of the drug epidemic. I'm not sure whether Jimmy Carter was aware of America's intelligence agency's involvement in the drug trade, but it would seem that he had some ideas as to where a lot of drugs were coming from. And for those of you who are not familiar with the term, plausible deniability, look that up. Just imagine for a second if the U.S. focused its resources on the importation of drugs into the country as opposed to the usage of the drugs once they got here. I think in order for that to work, the U.S.'s intelligence agencies would have to work for and not against the so-called war on drugs. President Carter would have his work cut out for him, as America saw a 700% increase in consumption and demand for cocaine from 1978 to 1984. Cocaine consumption in the U.S. went from 19 to 25 tons to about 71 to 137 tons in that 6-year time span. President Carter wanted to focus on who was supplying the cocaine to the U.S., but he also wanted to decriminalize marijuana as well. In 1980, we see the explosion of crack in black and low-income communities. A year later, Jimmy Carter would lose his opportunity for re-election to Ronald Reagan, who would take office in 1981. In the 1980s, we see the result of criminalizing African people as crack tears through the black community, destroying everything in its wake. Crack cocaine is highly addictive, and when you do not have money to support a drug habit, it will eat away at your life like battery acid. The research that was conducted on the use of cocaine told the American government everything that they needed to know about this drug, like how smoking it was more addictive than snorting it, because you take in higher quantities, which allows it to get into your bloodstream much easier, which then allows for chemical dependency. Remember this guy? In 1981, President Ronald Reagan gave a speech saying that it was more quote-unquote effective to fight the consumer side of the drug war than the supply side, the exact opposite of Carter, mind you. According to Reagan, it was a quote-unquote losing proposition. During the first year of Reagan's presidency, the budget for drug programs that were designed to break up and eradicate the drug trade went from $437 million to $1.4 billion. Keep in mind that cocaine consumption rose 700% between the years of 78 and 84. In 1981, the consumption rate had not peaked and was on a steady rise, even in the midst of this new budget increase. It seems strange and ironic to me that since the quote-unquote war on drugs was declared in 71, that the rise in trafficking and consumption grew steadily. Keep in mind that after the Reagan speech in 1981, to focus on the consumer side of the drug trade, prison populations grew exponentially. I don't cover this in here, but a lot of things that happened with this stem from some of the same people that were dealt with during the drug epidemic, or the beginning of the drug epidemic. CIA Inspector General Hitz testified in front of a congressional committee. He states that there was, quote-unquote, no evidence of, quote-unquote, any conspiracy by the CIA or its employees to bring drugs into the U.S. Hitz also stated, quote-unquote, however, during the Contra era, CIA worked with a variety of people to support the Contra program. Hitz went on to say that there were, quote-unquote, instances where the CIA did not cut ties in an quote-unquote expeditious or consistent fashion with people who support the quote-unquote Contra program. Under a 1982 agreement between Ronald Reagan's Attorney General William Smith and CIA, quote, officers were not required to report allegations of drug trafficking. I repeat, were not required to report allegations of drug trafficking, end quote. That had anything to do with quote-unquote paid and non-paid assets of the CIA. This would include the pilots who would fly supplies to the Contras and Contra officials. Take some time to soak in this image and read this caption. And you guys can pause the video here and take some time to read over this. This is just me giving a little bit of exposition on some things that kind of played a part in the drug trade in this country on the back end. America would like for its citizens to believe that the drug epidemic, which is a large part of the crime rate in the U.S., just evolved naturally. They would like for us to believe that the transportation of cocaine into America and the targeting of black communities, the most undervalued in America, by the way, was all coincidence. The strange thing is, even after all of the evidence and even after the testimony of government officials, America still does not see the truth in this ongoing war on Africans or drugs. Now that crack cocaine found its way into the black community, government and law enforcement can now continue their mistreatment of Africans with the full protection of the law. It was okay for black people to be racially profiled, to be stopped and frisked by the police and harassed also. We have come full circle from the days of the watchers and the patrollers who were made up of KK members and ex-Confederate soldiers. Remember, their job was to keep track of the movements of Africans in America, to monitor our communities, to keep us in line, to control our actions, and to make sure we are not where we do not belong. In 1986, there would be a huge increase in incarceration rates in the U.S. The anti-drug abuse policy in the U.S. would focus more on abuse and use of drugs rather than the prevention of importation. The continuation of Nixon's war on drugs by Ronald Reagan, who became president in 1981, set the tone for black communities for decades to come. As an extension of the war on drugs, which targeted blacks and made sure that law enforcement would do the same, the 1986 Anti-Drug Act would almost ensure incarceration. Let's not forget the Sentencing Reform Act of 1984, which pretty much guarantees sentencing disparities by race. You see, because crack was hand-delivered to black communities, it was then labeled the drug of choice by Africans, while powder cocaine was considered a white person's drug, and less addictive also. In 1984, we get the Sentencing Reform Act, but it wasn't until 1986 that we would see the 100-to-1 ratio, which was required under federal law. The 100-to-1 ratio means if a black person is caught trafficking and or possessing 5 grams of crack, they receive a minimum 5-year sentence, while a white person will receive the same time for 500 grams of powder cocaine. Powder cocaine was seen as less harmful than crack. Crack produces an intense but short high, which makes it cheaper, and because it is in a condensed form, that it can be smoked. You take in more of the drug at one time. The 100-to-1 ratio was created based on laws passed through Congress. And since we know that crack was intentionally and or strategically placed in black communities, isn't it fair to say that the U.S. government has conspired against Africans in America? The picture is clear as to what has happened here in America. A group of people have been singled out by not only individual civilians, but by law enforcement and even government. This is what the war on drugs has done to black communities across the country. Africans in America have been singled out because of the attention that has been given to the orchestrated crack epidemic. Police profiling has become commonplace in the black community. The negative image of black people, stereotypes, were given to blacks by white people who in turn control the narrative by having control over society. Ergo, you place crack in poor communities. Sit back and watch the community split between the users and the dealers and the victims of both. As the problem grows, blame them all for the epidemic that was unleashed upon them, so that you can sit back and justify the negative stereotypes that you yourself created. From 1980 to 1990, we see crime rates grow by 28%, while incarceration for drug offenses rose 126%. Reagan's Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 now had a budget of $1.7 billion. Even with that kind of budget, we see the rise in crime and drug use. Manuel Noriega, who in the 1960s was head of the Panamanian government, was allowed to traffic drugs, cocaine, into the U.S. because of the military help he gave the Contras. The DEA wanted to indict Noriega in 1971, but they were kept from doing so by the CIA. George Bush Sr., who would become director of the CIA, paid Noriega hundreds of thousands of dollars a year for things he did in Latin America. So how is it possible that America is fighting a war on drugs while not only contracting a major player in drug trafficking, but also paying him to support the guerrillas they use to fight the Sandinistas and to sell drugs to Americans via the CIA? By the time of the 1990s, the civil rights and black power movements were, for the most part, completely eradicated. This false war on drugs had served part of its main purpose to disrupt, disorganize, and disband these movements. Another very important part of this war was to establish the criminalization of Africans in America. What is important about the criminalizing of Africans is that now you have a reason to constantly monitor them legally. Just like Jagga Hoover said, the purpose of COINTELPRO was to, quote unquote, prevent the rise of a messiah figure who could unify the militant black nationalists. In 1993, the U.S. government spent $2.5 billion on drug treatment and $7.8 billion on drug law enforcement. 2.5 million people could have benefited from the drug treatment with that kind of funding. Instead, only about half of that number will receive treatment, as estimated by the National Institute of Drug Abuse. So an estimated 1.4 million people did not receive treatment. A report that was published in 1984 by the New England Journal of Medicine states that the U.S. incarcerates about 1 million people a year as a result of the war on drugs. During Ronald Reagan's first term, America saw the budget for drug programs get an extra $1 billion. Cocaine and or crack consumption rose 700%, and incarceration rates jumped 800%. Reagan also cut the educational budget, which was at $14.2 billion, by 18.6%. So in the black community, we have a decrease in educational funds, an increase in police activity, and an increase in crack that was first introduced into the black community by the CIA, apparently. This is what the landscape in the U.S. has become, especially in the inner cities of America during the 1980s to 1993 when Bill Clinton was elected president. Even with a new president, the situation for Africans in America did not change, so far as the war on Africans or drugs was concerned. By now, police brutality, racial profiling, and neighborhoods devastated by the crack epidemic were pretty much commonplace. There are times when police violence and or brutality can cause civil unrest. In 1991, a man by the name of Rodney King was beaten nearly to death by LA police. The riots that occurred in 1992 happened after the 4 officers involved were acquitted of assault with a deadly weapon. The Rodney King incident was just one of many similar and unfortunate run-ins that black people have had with the police. This situation was unique at the time because the beating was caught on camera. America was forced to deal with the situation, a situation that seemed to be all too common for Africans. Black people seem to be a target for the police, and the law doesn't make the racial disparity any better. So if you are black, not only are you more likely to be stopped by the police, you are more likely to be convicted of a crime. From 1991 to 1993, 49% of the people who were arrested for drugs were black. However, black people only made up 16% of the people who sold drugs. At least this is what was reported by the Bureau of Justice Statistics in 1995. The information above is the exact opposite of what law enforcement and the government want Americans to believe about America. About Africans. Part 3 will be coming soon. Just take a look at some of these images of some of these black men and young men who have been murdered by the police.